this way. So I'm going to post recordings of these sessions to YouTube so people who can't take part in the synchronous sessions can sort of access the stuff. But yeah, it's not going to work super well today either, because the thing that I thought would make it work will work. People will be able to hear me at least. They'll at least be audio, and they'll be able to see the whiteboard anyway. But I was hoping for slightly better, but more things to figure out why they're not working in the future. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you had good breaks. This is super weird. I'll just say it right now. Yesterday was a super weird class. The reason everyone's starting off is muted, just so you know, is that with this many people, you can get some weird feedback issues. So the way it'll work, I'll say this even in 5 or 10 minutes in the future. If you want to basically raise your hand, go down to the reactions tab and give yourself a thumbs up. What it looks like on my end is I just see an enormous number of thumbnails for all of you. And I can't really, if you raise your hand or whatever, I'm not going to be able to see it. It's too tiny. But if you give yourself a little thumbs up or whatever, it'll be a relatively visible symbol. And what I can do is I can unmute you and then sort of make you the dominant speaker so that you can then ask a question or make a comment, anything of that sort. My goal is to have this be as much as possible sort of like normal class was. Obviously, it's not going to be that, but as much as possible, make it like normal class was. So this can still be sort of conversational. And the video recording will sometimes be interrupted by my cat, who just decided that now was the perfect time to jump on my lap. Maybe not right now. It was perfect, though. We're talking about living things, so we can have a living thing. Bring her in to sort of see. And there's also a whiteboard that I can sort of pull up. When this screen is up, I'm no longer able to see you all. I sort of lose the thumbnails. So keep the thumbs up or whatever, and then I'll sort of jump back and forth between this view, the whiteboard view, and the normal view. We'll actually have a better whiteboard than we did in class, because this one doesn't have a giant screen going down the center of it. So progress, small steps forward, even if there's also some steps backwards. Feel free to either turn your video on or off. It's fine with me either way. It doesn't really affect anything. So before we get started, I guess, any questions? And if you have one, give yourself a little thumbs up or whatever of the reactions tab. All right, just a quick little note. So we're gonna, for probably next Thursday or maybe the following Tuesday, I haven't decided exactly which, we're gonna need to have the Do Androids Dream electronic sheet read. So that'll be coming up soon. So maybe start getting that text read. I'll put a note on Canvas about it too. And that's the last, I believe that's the last of the required books that I had you get. So start reading that. We'll need it either at the end of next week or the following week, depending on how long stuff goes. My guess is we're gonna have to go a little bit slower doing it this way, but maybe not. We'll sort of see. I just gotta, you can also send me questions on chats like someone just did. It might take me a little bit longer to see the chat because I'm not looking at it as directly and it doesn't really give me a notification of it. But I got a question, when is the second paper gonna be due? Again, it's a little bit unclear, but the earliest it will be due is April 12th. Right? That is the earliest. It might even be the week after, depending on, this paper is going to be a little bit different from the first one. It's not really going to be possible to start it until we get a pretty good chunk of the way through both the Schrodinger and the Mayer readings. They're both going to be pretty central to the paper, to any of the paper topics, actually. So I might need to push it out even further, but the earliest it'll be due is April 12th. And I'll probably try to hand out the rubric, even though you won't be able to work on it right away, probably sometime early next week. Good. Any other questions? Got a thumb cap. Caleb, go ahead. There you go. Yeah, there you go. You should be unmuted.
Okay, cool. So with daily assignments, it's going to be Canvas thing due at 10:59, or
that's correct.
What? Whoops,
yep.
Missed that one. Just a heads up.
That's all right. There's going to be some issues. So the way the daily assignments will work is they'll just going to be Canvas assignments. So basically, they'll be Canvas quizzes technically. So you should be able to just click on it, and it should take you right to basically a place where you can just write a quick little essay. Same question as everything. Don't actually write an essay. 2 sentences still. Same 2 sentences as before. Don't give me more or anything. It's just, this is basically just a way for me to sort of store them and collect them. They're not going to have any sort of attendance purpose because I need to make the class available for people who can't actually come during the class period. So it's basically just turn it in at any point you'd like. Yep. Matt,
You mentioned that your recording was not working. I have it recording right now, so I can like upload that video file for you.
Why are you able to record? See,
I'm
my
doing
recording, my recording
using-
actually is working. I set up a laptop, so there's this guest person.
Oh yeah,
but for some, and the reason I did it is because I'd rather people actually see faces rather than just all these thumbnails.
Yeah, I'm using OBS Studio, so it's just a program. I'm just
Oh, okay, you're doing it.
Yeah,
you're doing it externally. All right.
Yeah.
I might take you up on that, depending on. I'm recording too, though it's just recording the boring thumbnail version. So I'll sort of see what I discover on that end, and then I might take you up on it, and then I'll just figure out why it's not letting me. It should, in principle, be letting me do it, but the technical issues certainly gonna be a thing. Good. Any other questions, or should we get started? All right. Let's get started then. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start sort of getting to the heart of this second unit. We're going to start with these two big accounts that I've sort of suggested about what distinguishes living from non-living systems. Right? And I said there were basically two big answers that people have given when we were going through the Sagan. These were the sort of two big answers that Sagan identified as sort of the most compelling candidates. On the one hand, there's going to be what we're going to call teleonomic properties. Right, go with Mayer. That's what we're going to start with today. There are certain properties that living systems have that are inexplicable on the basis of using physics and chemistry by themselves. You need another kind of explanation added in, and that other kind of explanation is the explanations that can be offered by biology. So evolutionary accounts, genetic accounts, those kinds of things. And those kinds of explanations are going to be irrelevant to understanding non-living systems, but it's going to be impossible to understand a living system without reference to it. So that's what we're going to work on today. The other account is an entropic account, where living systems are a particular way of basically resisting entropy that in way that non-living systems don't. This is going to be Schrodinger's account, and we're going to work on that one probably starting later next week. My guess is we'll spend 3 days on the teleonomic stuff and then 3 days on the entropy stuff. That's at least right now, anyway, my rough plan. We'll see how that works. I might need to shorten it, but so that's sort of the goal for today. What we're going to do today, it's a good practice day because I'm going to have to mostly do just lecture today. I don't have to do that anyway. Mayer sort of goes through the sort of history of biology really fast to try to distinguish how we sort of get to the sort of modern day, right? You know, here's the modern. Organicism is modern day biology, right? But before we get to that point, we sort of have to overcome what he's going to call a kind of shallow physicalism. That's sort of what we were reading in Descartes, this view of the organism just as a mechanism, but also a kind of shallow vitalism that wants to argue that what distinguishes living from non-living systems is some kind of like special, super magical life energy, right? I guess you could say you could blame Star Wars, sort of like the Force or whatever. Right. That the history of biology, what we call biology, is relatively new. It really only emerges in the late 1800s, really. What was earlier biology were these two earlier things, these sort of physicalist accounts, mechanist accounts, and then the vitalist accounts. And Mayer's argument is going to be that both of those are sort of overturned by the sort of organicist account that he's at the forefront of sort of inventing. Just a little background about who Mayer is. He's a very prominent biologist and philosopher biologist. So he's a pretty big deal to this day. He's sort of one of the founders of modern philosophy of biology and a biologist in his own right. So he's a very telling figure. It's going to actually be a little bit ironic. The other figure we're going to be looking at isn't going to be actually fundamentally a biologist. He's going to be a physicist, Erwin Schrödinger, as in Schrödinger's cat. Right, and he's going to argue that actually it's the entropic properties of living things that are the unprecedented one. These two accounts aren't exactly going to conflict, right? They maybe are compatible, but they're going to at least superficially suggest really different accounts of whether or not a thing is living or not, and particularly with the digital life forms. On the Mayer account, digital life forms seem like they're going to be possible. On the Schrodinger account, they're not going to seem like they're possible. So that's the sort of the big punchline, I guess. Excuse me, I need to go stop my cat from destroying things. I'll be right back. For some reason, my cat hates hearing me talk. So she starts freaking out and breaking things. Which will sadly get her evicted for today. Maybe try again. All right. So any initial questions before we sort of just turn straight into Mayer's account? That's the rough framework for what the rest of this unit's going to look like. Yep. Go ahead, you're unmuted.
Thanks. So I just wanted to ask what the relationship between like the earlier Greek and medieval philosophers were to these accounts of life. Like, are they similar to vitalism, physicalism?
Good question. That's a good question. So Mayer, who we're going to read another thing by him on Tuesday. He's going to admit that he's not an expert in the ancient or the medieval stuff. He sees the medieval stuff as largely being sort of pseudo-vitalistic in structure, but not even really. He just thinks it's really more just metaphysics. He doesn't really think anyone in the Middle Ages was doing really biology in the modern sense. He sees there as being a close connection between what he's talking about and what Aristotle was talking about, but he's also going to see there as being important differences too. So if anything, he sees modern biology as a little bit going back to at least the spirit of Greek philosophy, and the spirit of which Greek philosophy was describing life forms, even if there's going to be some important distinctions and important things that he wants to reject in particularly the Aristotelian conception of teleology. It's going to be super weird. He invents this word. I've said it a couple times. I'll just pull it up. And this word teleonomic. All right. And this is supposed to be in contrast with the teleological, which is the Aristotle word. They mean the same thing. That's the sort of funny thing. They actually basically are synonyms. The first one, teleonomic, means law, basically governed by what would be a good translation here? This means something like law-governed behavior. Let's go with that. And teleological, which is the Aristotelian, means something like maybe study of law, like study of purposeful behavior. They're basically synonyms, and he's going to acknowledge, and he's basically acknowledges that in the next article we're going to read, that they're basically just synonyms. But he basically thinks that the way that teleology gets used by people, at least after Aristotle, is really bad, and he doesn't want any of that. So he's coming up with this word teleonomic, to sort of account for the same kind of phenomenon that Aristotle was accounting for, but sort of not run the risk of falling prey to sort of the kind of view where you sort of see evolution as being driven towards some kind of final purpose or something. Or being some sort of expression of God's plan. He wants to exclude anything like that, but still wants to preserve the sort of like behavioral, the sort of purposeful driven behavior that evolutionary adaptability kind of like allows us to talk about. So, long answer. Does that at least was that a satisfying answer to your question?
No, yeah, it's perfect. I just wanted to know the difference between teleological and Aristotelian sense and
and
we're
not really gonna do that as much today, but we're gonna focus on that extensively on Thursday. Today we're really just gonna try to set up why he's talking about these teleonomic properties at all and what he roughly speaking means by them. That's gonna be our primary goal for today.
Okay.
All right. Go ahead, Rachel. You should be unmuted.
Awesome. Could you go back to the
Yep.
what you were typing just so I can finish copying it?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I'll be going back and forth, so I won't delete anything until I make sure everyone has it fully
Okay.
prepared.
Thank you.
All right. Good. Any last questions, or should we start going through going through the predecessors to the modern view? All right, let's go. And remember, when I have the whiteboard up, I can't see your questions, so I'll be sure to put it down every once in a while just to make sure I haven't missed anything. All right. So the mechanism physicalist view, we've already basically talked about it, so I'm not going to spend as much time with this one. This is what we were reading in Descartes, right? And he is sort of the sort of founder of it, and Mayer talks about Descartes kind of as the founder of it. The basic sort of thing that physicalists argue, first of all, they argue that living things are analogous to machines in some way. Right? And actually, Mayer points out, many of you I remember sort of saying, like, wow, it's sort of amazing, even though Descartes' wrong in all the specific details, it seemed like. It was sort of amazing how close he was in framework. And I think that's right. I think Mayer a little bit is going to overstate the extent to which people aren't still mechanists. He's going to oversell the extent to which people are organicists in modern biology. Certainly organicism is going to be a real thing in modern biology, but there are also still mechanists. Mayer's problem with mechanism more than anything is that it's just a really bad metaphor, he thinks. He actually just thinks living systems don't behave anything like any kind of machine, certainly any kind of machine that existed in Descartes' time, right? The way he puts it at one point, no machine has ever built itself or replicated itself, programmed itself, or been able to procure its own energy. Right? Maybe we can talk about modern machines, right, doing this, but certainly nothing like the clocks or the clockwork soldiers that Descartes would have seen displayed anything like the kinds of properties living systems had. And indeed, Descartes didn't study living things. This is going to be a constant sort of refrain. These early mechanists and physicalists, they actually tend to be more like physicists or chemists rather than actually people who are studying living things. The people who are studying living things themselves were all incredibly dissatisfied with the limitations of the kind of mechanistic physicalist accounts. All right, so what does it mean to say that we're saying we're analogous to machines? Living things reduce to non-living things. Right? You can know everything there is to know about a rabbit if you understand all of the molecules that make up the rabbit and how all of those molecules move, right? And so biology reduces to physics and to chemistry. Right? Because physics and chemistry, they tell you everything you need to know about non-living things, in effect, right? Even the most complicated non-living structures. So Schrodinger is going to talk about like really advanced crystalline structures. Chemistry does a perfectly adequate job explaining the development of those non-living structures, right? So if living things just reduce to these non-living components, right, atoms, molecules, then physics, the study of atoms, and chemistry, the study of molecules, will tell you everything you need to know about living things. So I'll just stop for a second. Any questions at either of these points? This is, I take it, a little bit review, though I know it was a while ago from the Descartes reading. Yep. All right. Go ahead, you should be unmuted.
Okay, so I guess I'm just a little confused by what problem Mayer had with physicalism, because he kept like being really scathing about it, but then when you get to the organicism section,
Right.
It seemed really similar in a lot of the base components that you can break things down at a molecular level to
Absolutely.
physics and chemistry. So I guess I'm just not seeing the distinction he was making.
So we're going to have more to say on this as we go, but at least for right now anyway, the key to the distinction is this idea of the reduction, right? So it's certainly true, Mayer thinks, and this is why he's not a vitalist, and that's why organicism isn't vitalism, It's certainly true that physics does a perfectly adequate job, and chemistry especially, or especially organic chemistry, does a perfectly adequate job of explaining the building blocks that living things are made of, right? So he says at one point, everything you need to know about organic molecules, you can learn by studying organic chemistry, and almost everything, though not quite everything, but almost everything you even need to learn about cells, you can learn about just by studying their sort of the constitutive blocks that they're made out of. He just doesn't think that's going to be adequate to understand a living organism. And indeed, he actually doesn't even think it's quite adequate for the cell. He actually thinks you need a little bit more even for the cell. Mainly, you need the idea of genetics and evolutionary biology, even on the cellular level, to fully explain everything. So organic chemistry explains the building blocks that life are made out of. It can help us understand how those building blocks are at play in organisms, right? But an organism is not exhausted by its building blocks, right? This is, and again, it should sound a little bit like the Aristotle, because it kind of is, right? The claim that organicism is making is that the whole is in a very real sense prior to its parts, right? And the whole is needed to explain the parts, and if all you're looking at are the parts, you're not going to actually see the whole. Does that help?
Yep.
Awesome. And we'll definitely say, we'll have a lot more to say. We'll look at some of his specific examples where he thought these early physicalists are all just goofy almost, like some of their sort of actual theories of life. All right, so let's go back to the whiteboard, and let's say a little bit more about what these physicalists are actually claiming, right? So, okay, we've got this idea of reduction. The other thing we've got, he thinks, is an emphasis on the stuff that things are actually made of, right? And what these physicists were, what these early biologists or protobiologists, what they mostly just tried to understand are the kinds of molecules that were present in living organisms. Right? Or what kind of molecules are present in an embryo, right? And so let's give a specific example of why Mayer thinks these kinds of accounts were just ridiculous from the standpoint of modern biology, right? A lot of physicalists argued that what basically an embryo basically was just a bunch of molecules arranged in a very particular kind of way, and those molecules just kind of bumped into each other frequently. And that's how you got a living thing. A living thing just emerged out of all these molecules bumping into each other, and so they kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then that was a life form. This caused a great crisis when one of these physicalists split a sea cucumber embryo in half, and he expected that what you would end up with, because you had half as much stuff, right? You had half as many molecules. He expected he would end up with two half-sized sea cucumbers. And what instead he got was two full-sized sea cucumbers, despite the fact that the initial bundle of stuff had been split in half, right? And of course, what would a modern biologist say about this? Well, yeah, the cells are capable of adapting, and so if you sort of split the embryo in half, it actually wasn't an embryo, it was technically two, the first split of the embryo into two cells. If you split those in half, they're capable of dividing on the basis of an evolutionary program. They're not simply stuff bouncing around. And so taking away half the stuff doesn't change anything, because the development of the embryo already has an eye toward the whole of the organism. You're not going to get many sea cucumbers by just splitting the embryos in half. That's simply not how this works, right? It's too much of an emphasis on the stuff. And also their explanations just in general were pretty vacuous, he thinks. They talked a lot about things like motion or energy. Without really having any good account or definition of what these things actually meant, and how in concrete terms they explain the kind of diversity and behaviors that were demonstrated by living things, right? These weren't usually people who spent that much time like looking at sea cucumbers or looking at birds. That's not what these mechanists were predominantly doing, right? They sort of had this basic principle, well, everything has to just reduce to motions of molecules, right? And anytime anyone pointed out, hey, it's not really clear how this particular behavior reduces to the motion of molecules, they would just say, oh, trust me, it does, right? It's very much a sort of black box theory. Right? One that really just, the explanations they were supplying just didn't do sufficient explanatory work. They didn't actually help explain what was actually going on with the living organisms that they were purportedly studying, right? And this was constantly being objected to by people who studied anatomy, for example, right? People who are actually looking not at the parts of the organism, but looking at like organisms in nature, or people who are going out and hunting birds would just be like, hey, these explanations, they don't seem to be doing very much. They don't seem to be getting us very far. All right. So that's probably good enough, at least for now anyway, for talking about these physicalists. Any questions? We went over this in pretty good detail when we were doing the Descartes, but any questions for anything right now?
I can't figure out the raise my hand button.
Oh, so go down to the reactions tab, and you give yourself a thumbs up or something of that sort. That's because I'm just looking at thumbnails, and they'll put a big little symbol by your thumbnail.
Because wouldn't like the whole thing I went into about like genotype and phenotype, that's like a very specific kind of almost down to the molecular.
Mm-hmm.
And almost every living thing has to have some sort of DNA. Wouldn't that be like work with mechanism? Like how?
Absolutely right. No, it's absolutely right. Mayer's not going to actually he doesn't have a problem with mechanism itself. That's not his target. His problem is mechanistic reductionism. Because he thinks you lose the actually explanatory force of something. So DNA isn't explanatory because it's a really small molecule. It's explanatory because of the way in which it's part of a genetic and evolutionary program that actually does explain why organisms display certain kinds of behaviors. It's not just because of the molecule itself, though, right? The molecule makes it possible to draw the genotype-phenotype distinction, which we'll talk about a little bit later today. But the early mechanists weren't drawing that distinction, right? Because it wasn't even relevant from what they were looking at. They just thought everything could be explained simply with reference to the stuff that things were made out of, right? And that's actually precisely not what's going on with the genotype-phenotype distinction, right? That's actually precisely a functionalist-formalist distinction between different kinds of sort of like behavioral properties that only living systems have, right? And again, we'll go into a lot more depth with this when we actually get to the organicist account later on. But does that help at least in a provisional way?
Yeah, that makes sense. Kind of how, yeah, the parts equal the whole thing versus just the parts are a thing itself.
Right, yeah. Good. All right. So Mayer thinks that these early physicalist explanations were just fairly obviously explanatorily inadequate. They just didn't work. They were bad scientific explanations, right? And lots of people were aware of this. The problem is that these people didn't have anything to replace it with. So people who were opposed to this sort of reductionist were called vitalists. Vitalism is really more of an anti-movement. They're anti-reductionists rather than any sort of coherent school on their own. We're going to see there's going to be all kinds of, there's all sorts of different kinds of vitalism. We're not going to need to go into all of the specifics or all the different variants because they're all wrong. So it's not really going to be worth going too much into the specifics, right? But this isn't really one coherent school. It's rather being opposed to the reductionism of the physicalists. So there's lots of different versions of it. Its definitive characteristic is positing that there is something that physics and chemistry don't explain that has to be involved in the workings of, or almost in the mechanistic workings of living things. Right? So when Mary Shelley is writing Frankenstein, right, she's working from vitalist biology, right? That's sort of the biology that's available to her. And so when Victor Frankenstein puts life in unliving organic matter, right, what he's doing is he's adding this something special, this little extra sauce, right, that brings the thing to life, right? And in all the movies, it's lightning, but that's actually not what it is in the book, at least. Like, lightning inspired it, but in the book, he won't say what it is. He won't say what he adds, right? The reason it's called vitalism, there's a vital energy of some sort, and this gets characterized in all kinds of different ways, that is unique to living things. And that explains all of the things that the physicalist account can't explain. Right? So, for example, what would it be? What kinds of things would it be explaining? Vital energy would explain why it is the case that you can go from a single cell, the embryo, to a full living human being, right? And why all of it happens seemingly in some sort of ordered direction, right? The problem with motion in the physicalist accounts is that motion is random unless it's directed by something. Right? And that doesn't seem to fit what we see with the development and the growth of living things. They don't grow randomly, right? They grow in what looks like a quite deliberate, purposeful way. What's supposed to explain that, according to the vitalists, is this vital energy. And it's not just the growth, also the directed behaviors of organisms. Right? The fact that a plant will slightly turn its leaves to get exposed to more sunlight, right? That doesn't seem to be random behavior on the part of the plant, right? That's directed behavior. It's the behavior that seems very clearly intended, in some sense of that word, to cause the plant to grow and to continue to get necessary nutrients. The vital energy is supposed to explain why this sort of directed growth and behavior is taking place. So we'll come back, but I just want to come back and see if there's any questions at this point. Go ahead, Caleb.
Yeah, so what did you mean by black box theory? Just like if you could expand on that.
So the idea of a black box theory is it's a theory where you just sort of say, where you have something that's supposed to do a lot of explanatory work, but you have no idea what it is.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
So you say, oh, well, it's some kind of motion. And I say, well, what kind of motion? And you're like, yeah, it's some kind of motion.
Gotcha.
Right. It doesn't, you haven't really explained anything. You've pointed to, and Mayer doesn't actually want to say this is even bad. Like, this is sort of a necessary first step in science, right? Like, the black box explanation kind of like points to a place where there's something that needs to be explained, but you don't necessarily know it really doesn't. Right? This is an accusation that gets leveled against Freud a lot in psychology circles, is that a lot of Freud's theories seem like they're these sort of like black boxes that like things are explained by like trauma. And what is trauma? Trauma is the explanation of trauma. Right? And it's like he doesn't have, it's like there's obviously something that needs to be explained here. Many people don't agree with this account of Freud. This is an accusation that gets leveled against them, at least, is that he's pointing to a place where something very clearly needs to be explained, and he's positing as if it's kind of a black box, right? Here's the explanation, but what's inside the box? We don't know yet, right? We'll need to do more work and figure it out. And he actually, and Bayer thinks this is, in a sense, fine. Like, this is how science has to work. You find a problem in a theory, you posit an explanation of the theory, and then try to figure out if your explanation really makes sense or if it's really doing any real work. So what he's going to say about the vitalists is the vitalists are completely wrong in everything they say, but they point to a real explanatory gap that later theories would indeed fill in, right? He actually says that, he said at one point in today's reading that it's amazing if you replace the sort of goofy words that the vitalists were sort of using to describe the vital energy with DNA, how neatly it all works. Like, DNA actually slots pretty neatly in. It actually fills the sort of explanatory gap that the vitalists are sort of pointing toward in the mechanistic sciences. So does that help, Caleb? Does that sort of answer the question?
Oh yeah, sorry, that's good.
Good. All right, excellent. So let's look at. Oh, go ahead. Yep.
Yeah. So this is what Mayer was accusing the mechanicists of doing, was sort of this hand wavy.
Yep.
It's something, but like not.
Yeah, it's some
just
kind of
weren't
motion. We don't
sufficiently-
know what kind, but some
Yeah.
kind.
Okay.
Yeah, and the vitalists are doing the same. And as we'll see in a second, the vitalists are doing the exact same thing. Right? They're going to wave their hands just as strenuously. Right? It's just that what they're waving their hands, pointing out at the gaps in the that the mechanists are just waving over the gaps. The mechanists don't even acknowledge the gaps that their account has, whereas the vitalists are pointing to the gaps. They just can't explain what fills those gaps properly. All right. Go ahead.
So, I guess skipping ahead a little bit, it seems to me that the organicist account would just seem to be, instead of a vital energy, and like a vital process, maybe, or like a vital direction. And so it's not really too different from vitalism. It's like an evolved form, I guess.
So here's going to be the important difference. Actually, this will be a good transition. So let me answer your question along the way a little bit. So let's talk a little bit more about precisely what it is that the vitalists were actually saying, and we'll hopefully see why it's a little bit different. So here's the actual kind of things that the vitalists were talking about. So here are some examples. Here's one theory. Maybe living things are made of a different kind of stuff. Than non-living things. Protoplasm. For all you Ghostbusters fans. And indeed, that's actually what they called it. They called it protoplasm. Right? This was supposed to be because they had good enough microscopes at this point that they knew they were cells, and they knew there was a kind of fluid within the cell. And they said, well, maybe that kind of fluid is made up of something completely different than other kinds of things, right? And so so biology would have to figure out what this protoplasm is. It's important to note this protoplasm is not supposed to be something supernatural, right? It's another kind of physical stuff. It's just not the kind of physical stuff that gets studied in physics or in chemistry, right? It's a new kind of thing. And this is, of course, just completely false. Right? The basic building blocks of life are no different from the basic building blocks of rocks, right? That's not the difference. Another thing the vitalists argued is that maybe there's some special kind of energy. Not found in physics. Right? That all living things have, but no non-living things have. No, sorry, wrote that backwards. That all living things have, but no non-living things have. Right? And this kind of energy, maybe it's connected to the energy of the cosmos itself and some of the more mystical of the vitalists. And maybe it explains why, the purpose of organisms and the purpose of life, right? They draw upon a kind of misreading of Kant in some cases, to actually as part of this sort of story, right? And again, this is just false. Right? We can understand the kinds of energy interactions that are taking place in living things with physics. They're looking for something different than what the physicalists are talking about. They think that sort of the only way to resist physicalist reductionism is to find a different kind of thing that you can reduce the properties of living things to. In a weird way, the vitalists are still actually kind of reductionists. They're just a different kind of reductionist, right? They want to reduce everything to some non-physical, as in non-physical in the sense of not physics, kind of stuff, and say that by reducing things to that kind of stuff, then we'll be able to understand all the properties that living things demonstrate, right? So that's why this isn't really the same thing, really the same kind of, it's not the same kind of thing that the organicists are going to be doing at all. The organicists are going to be fundamentally agree that, like, yes, the building blocks of living things are no different than the building blocks of non-living things. That's not the difference. The difference is going to consist in how those building blocks are organized. And as a result of very particular ways of organizing those building blocks, you're going to get radically different kinds of things than you have when you organize those building blocks in a non-living fashion, right? And we're going to need a different science to explain the special properties that the living organization has. So how are we doing with vitalism? And I'll go back to that screen because I'm guessing you need a little bit more. But how are we doing with vitalism? Go ahead.
One thing that I couldn't really, it's like between vitalism and organicism, it's like, what about like the intentionality of it? They admit it's the same parts and that like parts equal more than a whole, but some of the parts have like an intention, like they're almost designed, even if it is evolutionarily designed.
Right. Yeah, that's actually not going to be even in between the two. That's going to be organicism.
Okay.
That's going to be just straight up organicism, right? And the way that they're going to put it is that, like, kind of very similar to how Aristotle put it, like, you don't understand what the heart is unless you understand how the heart fits into the entire rest of the organism, right? The heart doesn't make any sense on its own. It only makes sense organically. That's actually what organic literally means. It means whole, right? The heart only makes sense in terms of the whole. So that is actually not even a middle ground. That's going to be just organicism itself. Good. Any other questions about vitalism? Right. There's no vitalism really anymore amongst actual scientists. Go ahead, you should be good.
So I'm kind of a little confused because it seems like they're saying that the parts are not like equal, like just adding all the parts together doesn't equal the whole is more than that. But
the vitalists or the organicists?
Yes,
checking.
The vitalists. But it also sounds at the same time like they're like, well, if you added this one extra part, then they would all add up to equal the whole. Like that's what's the? That's
a great question. So the connection between, you're right, those do seem to be two competing ideas. The way that they're connected is what the little something extra that we add is supposed to actually explain is why all of those parts come together to form a meaningful whole. That's the thing that you can't explain without them, they think, right? So you need this vital energy driving the cellular division of the embryo to explain why it's not just random motion, right? It's not just random motion because it's this special kind of vital energy as opposed to the normal random energy, right? And that's why you get organized wholes that have these properties that are different than the parts have. Does that help? Does that clear that up? Awesome. Good. Any others with vitalism? You still hear vitalism, not amongst so much scientists, but you hear it amongst sort of the average person, actually, right? And you actually see it frequently in like science fiction and fantasy novels, especially. That's actually one reason why this is a good topic for this class. Where like there's some sort of like special life energy that living things have, right? A life energy, right? That's somehow different from other kinds of energy, right? But this is just not true and not explain. It's not more than not true. For Mayer, the problem is it's not explanatorily needed. You can do all the explanatory work without it. And so the vitalists are right when they pointed out, hey, the mechanistic explanations don't explain how you get actual organisms, how you get actual wholes. But their explanation of how you do get wholes, we just found much better explanations for it anymore. So if you want to put it this way, the vitalists pointed out the problem, but they couldn't solve it. right? And their solution, these energies or these special kinds of protoplasm or whatever, they're just more black boxes. They couldn't really explain what any of them were. They kept trying and couldn't discover any of them. They couldn't find any of them. All right, so how are we doing so far? Ready to turn to organicism? All right. So I'm going to erase the physicalism and just sort of basically slide the board down a little bit. All right, so let's talk about the organicist response. The organicists emerge pretty quickly once you start getting better explanations. Right. Evolution isn't enough. Evolution by itself doesn't solve all the vitalist worries, but it solves a big chunk of them. You also need to add basically genetics. The combination of genetics plus evolution, that basically is what will solve all of the vitalist worries. That's what will get rid of them. Because evolutionary explanations don't require there to be anything other than physical stuff. And yet they account for a lot of the kind of behaviors that the vitalists were objecting that the mechanists couldn't explain to. And it does so with a kind of explanation that's inapplicable to anything else other than living things, right? We sometimes talk about, and like geologists will sometimes talk this way, about like the evolution of a rock strata or whatever, but actually they're not talking about Darwinian evolution really. That's just a bad metaphor. Because the specific kind of evolution, the natural selection that Darwin points toward, it's not explanatorily useful to explain anything else besides living systems, right? That's why it was invented. It was invented to explain these directed behaviors, and it does it really well, and it doesn't explain anything else, right? You also couldn't have discovered evolution if all you were looking at was just molecules bouncing around. Think of it almost like this. If all you're looking at is molecules, right? So if you imagine like somehow you could look at a human body and just see all of its atoms, you wouldn't see a human body at all. You'd see statistically anomalous concentrations of carbon and some really weird, super complicated DNA molecules that you wouldn't know what they were. But that's all you'd see. You just see some anomalous carbon concentrations, right? You actually have to see the body first to understand it as an evolutionary subject, right? And then genetics adds the last little piece to it. Genetics does the same thing, but in this case, explaining the directed growth of the living organism. Right. So the evolutionary side gives you directed behaviors, and genetics give you the directed growth of the organism. So let's pause for just 1 second. So how are we doing so far? Any questions so far? Go ahead. You should be unmuted.
Yeah. For you said like once the theory of evolution came along, it didn't just do away with the vitalist theories. Was it like evolution came along, the organists started like having that view, and then once genetics came along, vitalism kind of got thrown out?
Basically, that's basically the order. It's not full-blown DNA, but once they basically in the 30s started to know what DNA would have to look like, that something like DNA had to exist, that basically sort of solves all of the gaps that the vitalists were concerned with.
Okay.
Right.
Cool.
So they sort of, it's sort of, the view just sort of disappears once an explanation that sort of solves all of their worries gets discovered. Because basically their view was more of an anti-view than a pro-something view. They were opposed to what they saw as the way the mechanist reductionist account just ignored certain features of living things. And once you got mechanistic explanations of those things that were previously being ignored, right, that were no longer reductionist explanations, there almost just wasn't really a cause for being a vitalist anymore. We haven't found any protoplasm, we haven't found any vital energies, right? But we have this Darwinian theory that accounts for all the stuff we really thought needed to be accounted for, so there's not really any reason to be a vitalist. Does that help? Does that?
Yeah, that's good.
And you sort of needed both together. Vitalism hangs on a little bit after just Darwin, and indeed the vitalists they tend to be really anti-Darwinian, actually, right? Because Darwin sort of seems like it gives them a way out. They also, Mayer says, don't really seem to have understood Darwin especially well. And that once Darwin became better understood and people realized that it wasn't reductionist in the same kind of way, they're like, oh, great, this just sort of solves the problem. Let's not worry about vital energy that we can't find anyway, right? This seems to be explanatorily adequate. So how are we doing? That good? All right. Let's say a little bit more then about what is the positive sort of account that these organicists are giving. So again, I'm going to sort of just slide us down again. My little stars are causing me problems. I probably shouldn't bother with stars anymore. All right. The key sort of from the philosophical perspective, the key new thing that the organicists are offering is an account of emergentism. Higher order, more complicated systems have properties that are neither reducible to the properties of their parts, nor predictable on the basis of the parts. So let's do some concrete examples of this idea of emergentism, because it's actually really concrete. It's actually not especially abstract. A whole bunch of cells sitting in a petri dish, so let's say they're human cells. You know what those cells can't do? Talk. But if you take, indeed, let's actually just say, imagine, it's a sort of a weird thought experiment. Imagine you just took every single cell out of my body and just like put it in a pile somewhere. So it would be very gross, first of all. But okay, we've done this. We have the gross Paul cell pile. Okay, you know what? Even all of those cells, you know what they're not going to do either? Talk. Right? They're not going to walk. They're not going to move. They're not going to perceive the world. They're not going to maintain themselves. They're not going to engage in sort of a metabolic activity that preserves themselves. What are they going to do? Make a smell, like a very foul smell, because I basically just described the decomposing body, right? That's basically what I just described, a bunch of the parts not organized in the way that they actually had been organized, right? The idea of emergentism sort of hinges on this idea that when you organize parts in particular ways, they develop new properties. Right. It's not enough to just understand the parts of the living thing. You have to understand how those parts are fit together, how those parts are organized. And once you do, then the parts start doing something new, right? They stop being, my heart stops being a weird pile of cells that are making a foul stink, and it starts pumping blood. It doesn't do that in isolation. It only does that in the context of the rest of my body. We got a question here, like, would this be the rise of a kind of emergent dualism? Maybe of a sort, like you get a kind of dualism, but it's not any kind of physical or metaphysical dualism. There's not two kinds of stuff. And there's not really any supernatural explanation at stake here, right? Everything is physical stuff, right? It's just physical stuff organized in different ways has different properties, right? So we can draw dualism, for example, between living and not living, right? But that's not on the basis of different kinds of stuff. It's that the kinds of properties you get in the living systems, they're just different than the kinds of properties you get in the non-living systems, and you'd need a different kind of science to account for the properties in the non-living system than you would to account for the properties in the living system. The living system is going to have more complicated properties and more complicated mechanistic explanations of how those properties emerge. For example, evolutionary explanations for how those properties emerge. I also just got another question. So is life defined by emergent properties like talking? Basically, that's basically going to be what Mayer's going to say. He's going to define it as a particular subset of emergent properties, though, because really, this idea of emergentism isn't just found in biology. This is a philosophical theory. It's much more broad than that. It's going to be the specific kind of emergent properties that are going to be specific to living things are the teleonomic properties, right? And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit for the rest of the day. So I hope I did a good job. I hope that answered those two chat questions I got. And if you want to follow up, follow up. Either send another chat or do the thumb raise. Not a hand raise though. I think. Go ahead.
Hey, sorry. I just wanted to ask if the emergentism kind of perspective has any explanatory power when it comes to consciousness. Like, have people tried to apply that to the phenomena of being conscious, like the soul?
Absolutely. Some metaphysicians have tried to apply it to consciousness. You'd be outside of biology at that point, right? Because it's not clear that consciousness is a biological category. But yes, some metaphysicians have, or maybe some neurobiologists, maybe consciousness is a neurobiological concept, have tried to use this idea of, they argue that consciousness is an emergent property of particular kinds of neuron arrangements or things of that sort. Yeah. And I don't, probably that's the dominant view, though it's with consciousness stuff, it's a little bit complicated. A lot of people want to reduce consciousness to a kind of program, a software program within the neurons rather than the arrangement of the neurons. But you do get people, particularly people who want to emphasize that no, there's something special about the brain itself that has to do with consciousness. Those people tend to go in emergentist directions to explain consciousness and its emergence. Quite literally, it's emergence, right? Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Absolutely. Good. Any other questions, or should we say a little bit more about organicism first? All right, let's say a little bit more about organicism, and we'll come back. We're getting near the end of the day. Okay. The key thing for Mayer is that these new properties require a new science to study them. Right? Not because there's something different than organic chemistry going on in the basic fundamental structure of these things. Right? Organic chemistry is perfectly adequate to explain the basic building blocks of life. You don't need Darwinian evolution to explain life's building blocks. What you need is Darwinian evolution to explain some of the emergent properties. They're simply not what physics and chemistry study. I mean, it's almost as basic as that. There's like, what is physics intended to study? Elementary particle motion. What is chemistry intended to study? Chemical interactions, right? Neither of those are simply adequate to explain the emergent properties that occur in higher order living systems. You need other sciences to explain them. You need, in particular, what are these sciences? You need evolutionary biology and you need genetic biology, right? Those kinds of explanations are useless unless you're describing these emergent properties. So they're not needed in physics and chemistry. Physics and chemistry are still just fine the way that they are, but they're not enough to account for what's going on in living things, because living things have these properties that are just not the properties that get studied in chemistry or physics. Right? And so what something like Darwinian evolution lets us do, so let's just use that as an example. Here's an emergent property. I already mentioned it, right? That the plant will sort of turn to its leaf to better be exposed to the sunlight. All right? Why does that happen? Well, okay, there's a whole bunch of chemical interactions that take place, right? And organic chemistry does a really good job of explaining those chemical actions, but that's just not enough, right? Because why does it do that? It does that in order to get more sunlight, right? It's a kind of purposeful behavior, right? And you can't, and Mayer's going to argue this, you can't, there's a huge difference between these two sentences, actually. Let me write the two sentences up. This will be a little bit foreshadowing for next class. Consider this difference. The leaves turned, and then the plant got more sunlight, not the planet, the plant, versus the leaves turned in order to get more sunlight. Right? All you can do on the organic chemistry standpoint is basically all you could say is the first. Right? To actually explain what's going on, you actually need to be able to say the second, though. The second is more explanatorily adequate to explain the actual behavior that the plant is demonstrating. Right? Now, it's not doing it consciously. It's not like the plant's deciding, I'm going to get me some more sunlight, right? Why is it doing it? It's doing it because as a result of a series of perhaps millions of years of natural selection pressures, right? Plants just started doing this because the ones that didn't do it died, right? But that doesn't change the fact that what is the behavioral result of all of that Darwinian evolution? It's a kind of purposeful behavior. It's what he's going to call a teleonomic behavior. Along the same lines, you don't understand the heart unless you understand that the heart, what is it for? It's for pumping blood, right? And why do we have the kind of hearts that we have? Because they pump blood better throughout the body, right? Or eyes. Eyes are astounding at an evolutionary level. Eyes are one of the most perfect structures that exist, right? Why are they so perfect? Because they do the job that the organism needed perfectly. Right? Now, there's no magic here. It's not that some magician said, let there be eyes, right? Why are the eyes so perfect? Because that's the system that was best able to respond to natural selection pressures, right? So that's the one that got selected for. It's still entirely mechanistic, Mayer says. We're actually not leaving mechanism behind. What we're leaving is reductionism behind. The early vitalists, not the early vitalists, sorry, the early physicalists, they wanted to only give this first kind of explanation. Mayer's argument is that you need to give the second one if you're actually going to adequately explain what life forms do. Right? And the second needs evolution and genetics to explain. Right? Whereas no other kind of living thing needs those kinds of explanations. A rock, or let's not do here, but my little Jawa bobblehead, I shook it and then its head moved. That's adequate, right? Its head's not moving in order for anything, right? But I screamed when I got bit by something in order to warn my fellow humans of the danger of the snake, right? You need that in order to with things like me. You need it with things like a bacteria. You actually probably need it with things like a virus, right? But you don't need it for a rock or I don't know, or a Luigi toy. Right? Neither of those need that kind of explanation to fully adequately explain. That's the heart of the difference here. The heart of the difference is you need these evolutionary kinds of explanations to explain the living things. So I saw a hand up. Give me just 1 second. I'm going to write one last thing on the board for the day. We're actually getting from Mayer a really strong account of what does it mean to be alive. To be alive is to have teleonomic properties that require evolutionary genetic explanations. And he goes through a whole bunch of things at the end of the essay that it could mean. And indeed, they're all fine, but what it all sort of basically boils down to is evolutionary and genetic explanations. All of the other features he points out, that's sort of the heart of it, is that you need to give this special kind of explanation for living things, and you don't need to give this kind of explanation for other kinds of things. All right, there were a couple hands up I saw. I think Connor, I saw you, so go ahead.
Yeah. For these teleonomic properties, or like I guess specifically with the leaf example, is like this account of like, yes, there is a purpose behind this act.
Right.
That is not, they're not equating that to it being a conscious act.
Absolutely.
It's just
right.
Okay.
Yeah. Almost think for, and this is actually good for Aristotle too. Think of teleonomic as directed behavior. It's behavior towards something. That's actually literally what the word telos means. The telos of something isn't actually its purpose. The telos of something is what it's pointed toward. Right? So literally what's the telos of human beings? Death. And in one sense, in normal Greek, you'd say it's death. Because it's just like where our lives point to, where they end. Right? So the sense of teleonomic here is directed behavior. Behavior that's toward an end. It's not that the plant's choosing it or anything like that. Right? It's natural selection is the reason why this directed behavior exists. But you have to understand it as directed behavior. It really is directed. And if you tried to understand it without understanding its direction, you would just not get adequate explanations. That's what Mayer is arguing. Does that help?
Yeah, that's good.
All right. And I also got a chat question I see about asking me to compare these teleonomic behaviors with, say, technological behaviors. Right? So like if I make a chalice, for example, to use the Heidegger, right? Okay, sure, is the behavior of the chalice directed? Kind of, right? But that's directed externally, right? The chalice isn't directing itself. I mean, the chalice is just sitting there pretty much, right? But even like a really simple robot or a clockwork machine that I wind up, right? It's maybe moving, but it's not moving on the basis of its own direction, right? That's the key thing. We'll talk about this more next time. That's a key thing that's getting added by genetics. Genetics is a program that the organism actually internally follows on the basis of its own inner nature, right? And that inner genetic code, that's the one that requires the evolutionary explanation for, and that's the one that explains the kind of special kind of directedness that living things show that my little clockwork toy soldier doesn't. So I hope that answers the chat question that I got. All right, so how are we doing with this? How are we doing with this distinction? Is this distinction making sense? All right. Here's a key thing to note, right? Note how different this is from what we were being told in the Peri article that we started this unit with, right? That life is just not useful it's not a useful biological category. In fact, if Mayer is right, life is the crucial explanatory category for biology, right? Life is the category that gets explained by the special kind of explanations biologists themselves give. Genetic explanations, evolutionary explanations, okay? And anything that those explanations are relevant for are living things. This is not just useful in biology, it's actually the very essence of biology itself. Biologists that aren't studying living things aren't studying biology, right? They're not actually engaged in the special kind of explanatory project that biologists are supposed to be engaged within, right? They might be organic chemists, which is very useful, and indeed what the organic chemists are doing will be quite helpful to the biologists, right? Because all of the pieces of the organism are going to fit together really nicely. Me considered as a bunch of organic chemicals, me considered as a bunch of cells, me considered as a bunch of me considered as a bunch of organs, and me considered as a whole, all of those things are going to neatly fit together. So what the organic chemist is teaching the biologist is really valuable and really useful, and will help give a much more complete story. It's just not explanatorily adequate. If you think you can do what you're doing and not be talking about life, you're not doing biology. You're doing something else that maybe is helpful to biology, but isn't the same as it. So we've got our first actual criteria for a living thing, which is pretty cool. So okay, that's what I have for today. We're running near the end of the time anyway. So any last questions or comments? Yep, go ahead. Let me unmute you. Go ahead.
I was curious, like from this standpoint, if you'd be able to make an argument for another kind of life form, if that makes any sense, that doesn't fit into like our idea of what you'd say is a life form, like carbon-based life form.
Yep, absolutely. Mayer himself isn't going there. He's too much of a scientist. He only wants to talk about things that he's seen. But people are going to use this kind of theory to justify not just non-carbon life forms. That one's almost easy. If they can be explained by evolutionary pressure, is fine. We can also use it to explain any kind of artificial life form, any sort of machine that needs evolutionary kinds of explanations, and also any digital thing that needs evolutionary mechanisms to explain it. And what we're going to see the last day, next Thursday, what we're going to read is we're going to read an evolutionary biologist who argues that not only is digital life possible, it exists. People have made programs that require evolutionary explanations to explain the properties that they demonstrate, and so that therefore those digital organisms are alive, right? Because they need the same kind of explanation that we require to explain, at least in terms of biology. And so, yeah, this is going to be probably the more expansive of the view, the metabolic entropic view that we'll do next. That one's going to want to put a cutoff point. It's probably going to be okay with maybe a silicone-based life form, but after that, it's going to get pretty suspicious. Good. All right. Well, thank you all very much. This is super weird, right? But actually, this is way better than the 100. In the 100 level class, they were all just quiet the whole time. So you all talking has made this a lot less odd for me, at least. So I appreciate that. I'm going to post a video of this. It's predominantly for the people who are going to have to do the course asynchronously, but feel free. I'll send the link out. It'll be on YouTube. Feel free to go back and review this if you'd like. And the next reading we do is also going to be another reading from Mayer. That's going to focus a little bit more on precisely what he means by teleonomic property and how is it different from various kinds of accounts of teleology. So he's going to really try to narrow in what is this special kind of property that only the living things are supposed to possess. All right. Thank you all very much. I'll unmute people if anyone wants to just chat with me for a few minutes as you leave. But yeah, class is dismissed. Thanks very much.
Holla, still in pajamas.
All right, yeah, everyone should be unmuted, so go ahead.
See ya.
See ya.